Howdy, everyone. In case you didn't know, Israel's been popping off. I didn't hit the record button, so I've got to do this segment again. Israel's been popping off. Now, it's been popping off, and it is due to Netanyahu, who is a Yahoo, to say the least, and a piece of shit, to say a middling amount of venom. Netanyahu fired the Israeli defense minister because the defense minister was not okay with the judicial reforms Netanyahu was attempting to press through. From my understanding is, and I'm not up on Israeli politics, so please take this with some salt. I'm sprinkling it all around, okay? Netanyahu's judicial reforms would have made Israeli citizens, they would have begun to treat Israeli citizens in the same way that they are treating Palestinian citizens, that they are continually, oppressing. Hopefully, once this all settles out, hopefully Netanyahu is kicked out of governance and the government of Israel is not going down a dictatorship line, they take a look at that and make their own, make betterances for the Palestinian people, of course, because what they're doing is unconscionable. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about what Netanyahu is doing. So within 12 hours of the firing of the defense minister, the 6% of the population had gone out and was protesting. And even more than that, well, in addition to that, so protests on their own can raise awareness, but very often don't actually get the change that you would want to see, right? And I mean, there are a lot of people protesting. As I said, 6% of the population within 12 hours came out to protest. Now, in addition to this, as I was saying, a general strike was called. Leaders of the labor unions called a paid general strike. So basically, the economy ground to a goddamn halt. One sec, tooth hurt. Sorry, I have a hole in my tooth, and sometimes it tweaks out. Where was I? Oh, right, the general strike. Now, as far as I have heard, the protests have stalled the judicial reforms that Netanyahu was attempting to pass. But also, that's not stopped, just stalled, right? So it is, how to say this properly? It's not done yet. And I've been seeing things from protesters that have said that they will not stop protesting until the judicial reforms are completely removed, which is a good thing. I'm hoping that they have the backing of the labor unions there and that they want to keep the general strike going until those are completely removed as well. Now we're going to move off of my memory and go into a Guardian article on the Israeli protests. So, far-reaching proposals from Netanyahu's government are plans to allow a simple majority of 61, so 50, just half plus one, to override any of the Supreme Court rulings and allow politicians to appoint most of the justices to the bench. You know, I shouldn't have to tell you guys how bad that is. I want you to imagine. So let's take this into an American context because most of the people here will be watching in America, and this is a typically American-centric politics channel. This would be like saying the Senate has an ability to vote 51 people out of the 100 Senate seats to overturn any Supreme Court ruling and to replace and appoint justices to that bench. The changes are spearheaded not by the Prime Minister, but by his Levin. Yariv Levin. I was hearing about stuff about this guy. He's a fucking piece of shit. And the religious Zionist MK Ultra Simcha Rothman. Okay, lovely. So, what is happening now? Netanyahu's trial triggered 4 years of political crisis. Da 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 da. I want more on the actual protest. Here we go. We'll do an Al Jazeera article instead. Prime Minister B.J. Netanyahu statement, blah, 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 blah. As Israelis wake up after a tumultuous night of protests and an evening speech by the Prime Minister, many of them are adamant that the protests will continue until they achieve their demands. Prime Minister Netanyahu announced on Monday night a pause on his controversial judicial reforms to, quote, allow dialogue and to, quote, avoid a civil war. So in case you were wondering how much of a fucking kerfuffle this actually was, apparently he is worried about civil war. Succumbing to growing pressure from within his own coalition after day one of the biggest protests in Israeli history, the proposed changes would see Supreme Court's ability, basically just stripping the Supreme Court's ability to take stuff away, moving all of the power into kind of consolidating power in the government, which we've seen as always a great idea. He's not ready to tear the country apart yet. There's a silent yet there, I feel. And he says it's forbidden that there will be a civil... Oh, I'm sure you think that, bud. Just keep trying to be a dick. Sure, it won't happen. I'm just skimming here real quick. So yeah, that is the update on Israel. We'll see how things progress. I learned about this yesterday, and that means it had already been a couple of days since it had happened. And it doesn't seem to have grown too much larger, so that's good. Something that I did want to mention is in a lot of these protests, you see a lot of people with Israeli flags, and that is a good thing, I think, because it's going to be harder for the nationalists of that country to be criticizing the protests as being anti-Israeli. And as you can imagine from like the U.S., you see protests for like actually, I'm having trouble remembering if Black Lives Matter had a bunch of American flags in it. Okay, yeah. So like the right wing was really easily able to latch on to the BLM protests as being a anti-American protest, right? Because I mean, look at this. You see a whole bunch of solidarity for black people, right? And that is important. Don't get me wrong. But you also don't see a whole lot of American flags. You see like a communist red flag of resistance, right? I'm not saying that's a bad thing in and of itself, of course, right? but you don't see any national pride, which, I mean, why would you? It's sensible. But what this does is it does allow the Republicans and the right wing to get a hook into that optically and say, oh, well, clearly these people aren't nationalists. They're not here with the best interest of the country at heart. And then you turn to like the judicial overhaul in Israel, and well, you can say a lot of things about this, but you know what you can't say is that fucking they aren't there for their country, right? I mean, you see fucking flags literally everywhere. So, something to keep in mind, something to keep in mind.